Welcome to a Wednesday with Clear Mountain. Today we're joined by Amma Thanasanti. Amma, thank you so much for being here with us.
It's a pleasure. I'm grateful to be here and thank you for inviting me.
A
Yeah.
brief introduction. It's rare to find a teacher addressing the gap in meditation culture around healing trauma, let alone one who spent nearly 3 decades in robes. We're lucky to be joined by one now. Amma Thanasanti has been practicing meditation and teaching for many decades. She spent 26 years as a Theravada Buddhist nun with 20 years training in Ajahn Chah branch monasteries. She is the founder of Awakening Truth and the Integrated Meditation Program, a neuroplasticity-based relationally-rooted program designed to rewire patterns that traditional meditation may not reach. Amma's teaching weaves together classical Dharma, trauma-informed practices, and a deep reverence for the natural world. She shares openly from her lived experience as a doorway to connection, healing, and awakening. And we just only about a month ago were suddenly put into contact with Amma Thanasanti, and then those connections just began happening more and more. We heard about her from a community member and then discovered that we have various monastic connections, and it's just a joy to actually meet you, Amma. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah.
So to begin with, I just was hoping to ask what can you describe your journey towards realizing that the traditional tools that a lot of Buddhist systems provide us with aren't necessarily adequate to addressing all the levels of suffering or trauma which people encounter, and what made you feel that you needed to create the integrated meditation system and sort of a more robust way of addressing those issues in people's lives and practices?
So I love that question, Bante. I think really the answer is from my own direct experience. So, as you said, I've been meditating decades. It's nearly 50 years that I've been meditating. And went on retreats and had deep experiences and life changing and transformational insights. And yet there were certain kind of core beliefs or core patterns that wouldn't shift. So what was remarkable to me is that even with these like liberating insights, I could still go back to places where feeling like there was something fundamentally wrong with me. Or, I referred to that sense as like a basic sense of badness. And there was no frame of reference that I could find within the traditional teachings that made sense about how that was possible. And it wasn't a lack of determination or practice opportunities or immersion into teachings. And so I knew it wasn't just simply a matter of doing more. And I had enough insight to recognize it wasn't that I was doing it wrong. And so then there was just a sense of, okay, so if I'm not doing it wrong and doing more is not necessarily going to have a different result, then what are the other options? And so for me, the other options was to look and see about what other kinds of frames of reference and tools and modalities are there. And that led me into like parallel practices and alternative modalities and different kinds of therapies. And everything that I've done has had some value. There's nothing that I've done that hasn't been useful. And all along, there's been an interest in, seeing how these things integrate and how the Buddhist teachings support, where they diverge, and what the value of them is. And so the trauma work that I did for myself was hugely beneficial. But the attachment repair work that I did was mind blowing. And part of the reason why it was so mind blowing was because in a relatively short period of time, that sense of basic badness shifted and was no longer my baseline. It was
Mm.
not a place that I returned to again. And so for myself, when I recognized the difference in me and what my own personal experience was, and then I looked around both at my students and colleagues and what was happening in the monastery, it was sort of like all kinds of things made sense that hadn't made sense before in terms of understanding some of the complexities that we were navigating, and within a frame of reference didn't have the language to actually describe it.
Amma, could you say a bit more about, well, one, your name? What is this? What does Amma mean? And then after that, if you could maybe just define what you mean by the trauma work, and also by this this framework of attachment repair. What is that?
So you've asked me three big questions, and my memory's terrible. So you might need to you might need to ask them singularly if I don't get through the whole list. But my name Thanasanti was given to me at my first papaja, and it means foundation of peace. And at my bhikkhuni ordination, I was told that I needed to be referred to either as venerable or ayah. And neither of those landed great with me for different reasons. There was quite a hilarious story of my mother coming to my bhikkhuni ordination, and one of the senior nuns schooling her that from here on out she needed to call me venerable. And so my mother was having a conversation with her dog Lacey about this possibility of calling me venerable. And I was listening to the conversation. And it just was very evident that this was not an option. So I needed an alternative instead of venerable, and Ayah didn't work for me. And so when Ayattatthaloka, my preceptor, was saying, just in another complete different context, that Amma in the Pali language means dear one, I thought, I can do that. I can do that. I call people dear one all the time. So it's both respectful and it's mutual and it's honoring, and I can do that. So that's what Amma Thanasanti means.
Mm. Thank you very much. And I think it does have resonance with other languages. I think I know one of my Jewish friends in high school, their mother, we called her Amma. And it's also in Sanskrit, the hugging mother is Ammaji. And so that's cool that there's resonance there. And so the next questions were just about something which you mentioned, just trauma work and also this attachment repair. Those are maybe some concepts which not everyone would be familiar with.
So meditation is really excellent for dealing with things that are patterns that are within our capacity to navigate. So we can have disturbing emotions and disturbing feelings, but when it's something that we can actually metabolize, then we can use the Eightfold Path, the factors of awakening. We can use the foundations of mindfulness to pay attention to them and to bring skill to what is present. When something is beyond our capacity to metabolize, or when we're dealing with a freeze response, or we're frozen, then we need other tools to be able to navigate what we're experiencing, because the ordinary meditation is not something that we have access to. And so a trauma therapist, their number one objective is to keep you in an optimal state where you're connected with some of the material that is connected to the memories or the issues around the trauma, but it's metabolizable. You can stay with it. And in their support, they help you to bring things up, keep it manageable, and then they do specific things and tools to help you understand, digest, metabolize, and release it from your system. So trauma isn't so much the thing that happened, it's the response to it. And it's more of a neurological residue than it is a psychological problem. In terms of attachment work, so in the Buddhist world, attachment is like the number one thing that we speak to that we want to get rid of. It's the attachment to our greed, our hatred, and our delusion. And from the Buddhist languaging, attachment is like the cause of everything that's unwholesome in this world, and that we're in a really good position when we can make it less, relinquish it, let it go, and get rid of it. This word, attachment work, is not referring to that kind of attachment. It's referring to the bond that happens between a child or a newborn and their caregivers. And contrary to the Buddhist language of attachment, this attachment is absolutely critical for healthy development and growth. And so in the presence of safety and protection, delight, comfort, encouragement, then a healthy attachment formation forms between a child and their caregiver, and that optimizes being able to feel resilient and having a healthy view about oneself and a way of relating and trusting others and being able to track what's going on and to be discerning and to trust and to have pleasure and to have joy and to have fun. When that is disruptive, so when there isn't a sufficient amount of protection or safety, delight, comfort, soothing, and encouragement to express yourself and to explore, then a child creates adaptive strategies to cope with the absence of that. And those adaptive strategies are the attachment disturbances. And there's many different ones, and they've got slightly different names if they're described for a child or if they're described for an adult. But basically, like the patterns are that when the caregivers are dismissive, then we tend to shut down our emotions. When the caregivers are intrusive, then we tend to back off or from the caregivers. When there's both styles happening, then we alternate, and it tends to be we have both different patternings, and those patternings are confusing for ourselves as well as confusing for others to try and read what's actually happening. But the thing that is like kind of mind-blowing and really like got me very interested is that there's research that's been done that shows that when there are attachment disturbances, there's a couple of things that are reliably present. One of them is that we cannot track accurately what's happening for ourselves. The other is that we are much more likely to misinterpret what's happening for somebody else. Something also is that our processing speed is orders of magnitude less in terms of how we assimilate information and data and what we do with it. But the thing also that is just kind of stunning is that any time as a practitioner, or it's not any time, but it's a common experience that as we are approaching experiences of awakening, it's classic that we experience fear because there's less of an ego structure to hold on to, and in the absence of an ego structure, there's a certain kind of uncertainty and there's a disillusion, and in that disillusion, there's a natural expression of fear, and that's delineated in the stages of insight that Mahasi Sayadaw has written. And yet, when we have attachment disturbances, what happens is that the natural fear that comes from awakening activates an abandonment terror that comes from the attachment disturbance. And that abandonment terror is a trauma activation. And that trauma activation is not something that you can sit through or just focus on. And so, what it means for many, many people is that they come to a place where their practice deepens, and yet they have to back off because what arises for them genuinely is not something that they can manage in their meditation practice. And it's often the case that teachers don't understand what's going on and have support that is actually skillful to intervene.
Honestly, Amma, to hear you speak to this litany of kind of ways of coping, I can picture different people I've lived with and, who have various degrees of this. And the sense I get both in terms of a social um, kind of navigation and internal is just one of stasis and kind of stuckness. Not being able to metabolize information, not being able to um, sort of see how you're doing, how others are, and then being unable to pass through the dark night of the soul, so to speak. And in your Confessions of an Avid Meditator essay, you do talk about how I think the quote is, uh, when we look at trauma, our nervous systems go into flight, fight, or freeze response. We can't turn towards the resistance of not wanting something to be there because our nervous system is jammed. Furthermore, with most trauma, it is potentially harmful to suggest that turning towards the resistance of the pain is all that is needed to find peace. Usually, finding safety is needed first, unjamming the nervous system second. Then there may be the possibility to look at other teachings to find peace. So, how does one, yeah, like how does one heal that litany of problems? Like what means do you give people who have been or who find themselves in this situation for moving past it?
So that's part of the reason why prioritizing safety is so important. Because like the reality is that when a person has lived with a lot of trauma, it's often the case that they don't actually recognize when they feel safe or they don't feel safe. And so what's needed is, first of all, the permission to know that feeling safe is important, and tools and supports to help recognize how to see when we feel safe, how to see when we don't feel safe, what are the signs and symptoms of not feeling safe, and what are we able to do to advocate for safety as like number one. That's
Would
number.
you flesh out any of those subpoints? Just what skillful means are there to know when you're feeling safe?
So part of knowing to feel when you're safe is learning to track when you are inside your window of tolerance or outside of your window of tolerance, what the signs and symptoms of that feels like. And so when you have its context and contrast, when you experience feeling inside your window of tolerance, and you can get a sense of what it actually feels like when you start to relax, then that gives you some perspective when you go out of your window of tolerance. So the practices that I'm encouraging people to do is safe space visualizations and meditations, and learning to track so that they keep like at least 60% of their attention inwardly. And even when they're talking to somebody or they're listening to somebody, to always maintain a perspective where at least 60% of one's attention is tracking one's internal responses. Because the other thing that I have been like brilliant at is completely losing myself, but not in the right way, in the wrong way, in terms of merging with another where I don't actually track what's going on for myself. And so it's a relearning that staying present with oneself is actually an effective way of listening to somebody else. And interestingly enough, they often feel more heard when we are actually present with ourself than when we're merged with them.
Mm.
So part of it is coming up with language and practices that help understand and delineate the territory. Part of it is giving permission, like absolutely, like under no circumstances is it encouraged to do anything when you're not feeling safe. Like no way. And so like that was never once like anything that I ever heard in my meditation instructions that I received over 50 years of hearing meditation instructions. So this was something that I formulated as something that is helpful.
I was intrigued to see that suggestion that one stay, 60% within themselves, 60% embodied when you're interacting with another. And I'm curious if you ever feel like there is a space. You do also elsewhere talk about practice of non-dual awareness of different kinds. And I'm curious if you think there's ever a time, a right time, especially if there is this feeling of safety, to shift that percentage to either go 100% non-dual, or to if you feel it's always best to be 100% or at least 60% embodied. What is the sliding scale on this, depending on the individual and circumstances?
So that's a very beautiful question. I love that question. But the question, the premise underneath the question is that if a person is genuinely in a non-dual state, they actually do feel safe. And I think the challenge is that when we have a certain amount of unresolved trauma and attachment wounding, we can think that we're in a non-dual state, and actually we're in a different level of disassociation because we actually are not tracking the trauma and the impact of the trauma. And so one of the consequences of the years of all that I've been doing was the recognition that I was using the transcendent as a way to cover or mask some of the trauma that I had that I didn't have language for. And so there's a yes and. And so the yes is that when we're actually genuinely in a non-dual state, the 60-40 doesn't actually apply because it's not necessary. But until we've actually released the trauma in our system and have done some significant amount of attachment repair work, then there's a greater than probable chance that we're saying we're in a non-dual state. And what actually is happening is that there's some level of disassociation because we're not actually tracking what's really going on.
In terms of that step of kind of really moving past the trauma, you spoke about the first step of finding safety and learning what that means. And I love that advice about sticking with the body at least 60%, keeping the bulk of your weight attentionally, internally focused. That seems like a beautiful instruction to me. The next step that you list in that paragraph I read was unjamming the nervous system. What's the next step for healing trauma?
It a little bit depends on whether we're in a fight, flight, freeze, fawn, or the other responses in terms of like what is needed. So when we're in a fight response, but the fight is actually a trauma response, so then we need to differentiate between fight and anger and aggression as a trauma response, and fight and anger and aggression as a within our range of metabolizing responses. So when we have some capacity to make that discernment and we're actually in a fight response as a trauma response, then sometimes what is helpful is to allow that energy to move through us and to do things that allow it to release. Similarly, if we're in a flight response, then what's really helpful is to actually engage the big muscles of the legs. And so like jumping or running or bicycling or pedaling or swimming in the pool or kicking a pillow or something like that, where you're actually engaging the big muscles of the legs, because the primitive brain can relate to the big muscles. It cannot relate to us saying, but I don't need to do that. It's just ridiculous. And I can tell you a story. It was just like that.
Please.
I was in the middle of, so I've had health problems for a while, and one of the health problems was that I was dealing with multiple chemical sensitivities, and I was visiting, and a friend was very generous and offered to clean the house 4 days before I arrived and take all the cleaning supplies and put them in the garage so that I wouldn't have contact because anything was making me get triggered. So I was grateful, and I came into the house. It was fine, and I went into the room to where I was sleeping, and I got in the bed, and the sheets had been washed in fabric softener, and my system just, it was like as if I'd been walking through open machine gun fire. Like my system was relating to like a mortal danger, and I tried everything I knew. I mean, certainly I took the sheets off and I put them in a plastic bag and I walked them down the hall and I stuck them in a drawer. I did, and then I opened the windows, but my system was in an alarm, and nothing worked. No thinking, no tapping, no energy medicine, no meditation, but it's just fabric softener, 10,000, nothing worked. But the next morning when I got on the bike and I pedaled on the bike, in 5 minutes, In 10 minutes, 15 minutes, the activation was gone. And so we have to learn to speak Reptilian. And Reptilian is a different language. It's not interested in all the meditation techniques that I know. It doesn't care less. It wants to release the discharge, the charge. So my system is saying that I'm in mortal danger and I need to get out of there. And so if I convince that part of my brain that I'm actually getting out of there, I'm escaping the danger, then it starts to release its grip and then allows the cognitive functions to fire more and to have that part of the brain be more operational.
And what about the freeze response? How do you heal that?
So freeze response is actually the most difficult one because it's the last resort. And unfortunately, that's my go-to. So I have a lot of experience with it. And when we come out of freeze, first of all, it's highly labile. It changes. There's a huge amount of energy that's been stuck. And as it starts to release, it's very volatile and it can cycle very quickly through all of the others kinds of trauma responses. What helps me is safety and protection and textures and nature, weight-bearing exercises, contact with people that is very, very safe and attuned, gentle changes of temperature. So like I would walk barefoot on wet grass and gravel just to have the change in the contact on my feet between the wet and the dry and the hard and the soft. And what's needed is a tremendous amount of kindness and patience, both for oneself as well as for everybody around.
Thank you, Amma. Yeah, I really appreciate you foregrounding this feeling of safety. Ajahn Nisabho and I have kind of grafted on or seen this relationship between the questions, various questions that the Buddha would ask his disciples and kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so he would come up to a group of people and he would say, I hope you're getting enough alms food. I hope you're physically, physically well. And this is, some questioning of the Buddha as to, is there this feeling of safety? Are you internally okay? And I appreciate you foregrounding that because, as you say, it's oftentimes not appreciated. And I can certainly imagine a situation where maybe if one had a teacher where who was questioning that or not allowing for this internal questioning of safety, that would be a dangerous, potentially dangerous situation, which one should deeply question. I'm curious for like our own internal inquiry, how we balance, looking at our own internal sense of trauma, our own internal sense of safety, and balancing that with, not like infantilizing ourselves or not, you know, not potentially not challenging ourselves in a way which like is within our sphere of possible growth, like this the zone of proximal development. How do we, on the kind of challenging end of that spectrum, how do we make sure that we're asking intelligent and compassionate questions of ourselves to be utterly safe and to also cut our teeth in a sense, like to make sure that we're growing if that's possible.
So I think when one is in a trauma activation, the thing that one needs to do is actually to stabilize. That's the number one thing. And so that question has relevance when there's some confusion about what a trauma activation feels like. And there might be some doubt that one is presuming that one's in a trauma activation and one isn't. But I think when we are familiar with trauma, we've had different kinds of trauma, we know trauma lives in our body as residue. That's not a doubt. And I think one of the challenges is that coming from the Ajahn Chah tradition, where there tends to be asceticism and a certain amount of vigor in application of practice, and the culture is set up around supporting vigorous solar expressions of determination and energy. There's even less languaging around trauma and safety and pacing oneself. So Ajahn Viradamo told us the story when he came and spent time with us at Amravati about when he was a young monk. There's 13 Tadunga practices, and he was doing all 13 of them, which, if you're not familiar with the ascetic practices, I can't remember them all. You'd be able to help me. But one of them, okay, so the simple ones, which is part of our regular life, well, actually eating one meal at one sitting in a bowl, wearing only rag robes. But the big ones was only not lying down to sleep. And so all of the others, I think, were minor in comparison. So you have several compounding factors and when you stop sleeping, then everything starts to go a little wonkadoodle. So in Thailand, as a young monk, he was on the platform where the monks were, and he fell over off the platform and cracked his head open. And Ajahn Chah, who was actually very wise, said, just take it easy, I interpret that as saying, chill out, you're fine. Chill out. So if you have a master like Ajahn Chah present who has the ability to understand that tendency, as well as the culture of bringing tremendous vigor, and when it needs to be balanced, then you're in a better shape than if there's less wisdom around. Because Ajahn Chah was masterful in being able to understand when vigor was appropriate and when incredible kindness and gentleness was appropriate. Like, I remember another story. I wasn't at Chithurst when this happened, but I heard about it, and it was very striking, which was that the person who painted that phenomenal picture, the portrait of Ajahn Chah, he was a smoker and he had a lot of anxiety. And Ajahn Chah was just hanging out with him on the bench, smoking cigarettes with him. It wasn't talking about Dhamma. They were just hanging out doing something that he could totally relax with and feel like, this guy's got me, He sees me and he's got me and I'm good. And that's what's needed,
Yeah, Amma, thank you very much. Yeah, if one's only method is being macho, I mean, it's going to lead to madness. So I really appreciate your nuance, and I think you're totally right. Probably all of us need to be able to see what's right for us, and definitely the macho approach isn't the right one all the time. So
I think growing up in these monasteries, we're all very familiar with the hard limit of macho and how far that can take one. And people can post questions into the chat as well, and we'll get to those in a second. And we might keep you on the YouTube stream for maybe 5 or 10 minutes longer than we would usually. This is quite fun. But one thing I'm struck by is, you're speaking to addressing the most kind of blatant manifestations of trauma, but the languaging and the patterning, I see echoes of it all around me and in me, and that people have lived with. And I find it like quite interesting to see it at play in those more minor ways. And one of the things I've really seen take a lot of meditators and monks and cause a lot of suffering is kind of a steady, I don't know if it's an attachment disturbance in any sense, but it's just a drying up and this kind of machismo solar energy where that momentum can only take you so far, and the asceticism just cutting off. And if that happens over years and years, whether in a lay life or a monastic life, I really see a dryness and a brittleness of the heart. I don't know if that maps onto this trauma language at all, but you were in monasteries where this certainly was probably something you saw at times. And how does that map onto this trauma work? And if so, or if not, how would you address that particular vein of the Theravada?
Well, it's a fabulous question. I love the question.
Mm.
And certainly I am in no position to speak for anybody else's motivations, but I can tell you what I see in retrospect that I was doing. And what I can say that I was doing is that part of my determination, my fierce determination, and it was fierce, was because I felt that the transcendent was the only way out.
Mm.
And so for me, in my situation, I can see that my tenacity and ferocity was directly connected to the level of trauma and attachment wounding that I had.
Mm.
And so I was prepared. It didn't matter what the consequences were.
Mm.
But when I began to have language that would understand the trauma and tools to deal with it, and then language for the attachment wounding and tools to deal with it, it isn't the only choice. Transcendent is not the only option. We actually have different ways of healing.
Mm.
And that as we do that healing, as I have been able to do that healing, then instead of driving, there's a relaxation into being. And in that being, it's rich and juicy and luscious, and eros is present. All things are present. And so that is definitely able to allow the fullness of our being to flourish and to feel the warmth of our heart and the fullness of our radiance fill our whole experience.
Mm.
But when we're driving, partly as a strategy to compensate for the pain and the wounding and the trauma that has never had language or support to heal, then I'm in agreement that it ends up in a dead end road. And the repair from that dead end is stark.
Mm. We'll go to a couple questions. And this first question I'm also curious about. Could you speak to hypervigilance and how to calm that down when in social settings? And does metta practice help people that have had trauma go deeper in meditation? And maybe a related question to this hypervigilance is, how does one discern the difference between hypervigilance and the vigilance, like oftentimes appamada, which is, you know, sometimes translated as vigilance and as being like the whole of the path. There's a whole chapter in the Dhammapada about vigilance as being the path to the deathless. Actually, how does appropriate vigilance differ from hypervigilance? And I imagine they're just worlds of difference. But for people who might not be familiar with it, the language is so similar.
So, hypervigilance in the trauma response is a person is outside of their window of tolerance. And so, understanding window of tolerance, what it feels like to be in it when things are manageable, and what it feels like to get to the edge of it, and what it feels like to be outside of it. And so, I'm in agreement. It is a world of difference because hypervigilance, which is a trauma response, is actually something that is not manageable or sustainable.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Hypervigilance, which is part of the path of like sincere determination, you are in your window of tolerance and you know with conviction that there isn't anything in this unchangeable world that you can grab onto and that it's actually going to be something that's going to help you. You know that. And so then there's like this beeline, okay, if nothing in this world is something that I can hold on to, then where can I find freedom? And that was Deepama's response. You know, she was a meditation master. Before she became a master, she was literally on her knees. She was absolutely devastated with grief and loss. And there was nothing in the world that she was interested in living for. The only possible thing was the Dhamma. And by the time she got to the retreat center, she was physically so disabled, that she had to crawl up the steps. But her mind was strong and her capacities were strong. And so she brought ferocity to the practice because she knew in that context it was a way out. So even though the suffering she had was enormous, it was within her capacity to manage. It wasn't outside of her window of tolerance.
Thank you. That's great languaging, and a really extremely useful concept for people to start feeling within themselves. And it sounds like it'll be really clear when people do. And just the second part of that question is about using metta to heal trauma, and in general, how to relate to hypervigilance in social settings. If you could.
Well, part of the reason why trauma therapists are worth their weight in gold because they help hold you so that you are in this magic zone. And this magic zone is where you have access to the material that is activating, but you're able to manage it. And when you know what that feels like, then you have more capacity to use things like metta and help yourself. When you don't know what that magic zone feels like, then sometimes you're using metta as a way to ameliorate when you're out of your window of tolerance. And metta is good, but it's not the best. I don't know what the best is. Maybe it is the best. I think the best is whatever helps you get back in your window of tolerance. And so for different people, it's going to be different things. And for some people, metta might be the thing. But the problem is that when we're genuinely out of our window of tolerance, our ability to actually connect with metta, to focus our mind, to bring forward thoughts of metta, all of that is going to be very, very impacted. Because the very first thing that goes offline when we move out of our window of tolerance is our connection to our prefrontal cortex, our discernment, and our ability to be able to think ourselves through things and even to remember the tools that work for us. So that when we're having, like for me, sometimes when I get activated, it's more like a body memory than it is a thought of like, get to the forest, go sit on a rock, go find some dogs in a dog park and put my hands in their fur. It's just like, it's like an almost a body sense that takes me into places that I know in the past have been generative and healing and help me get back into, or for me now, no longer a monastic, I can dance. And in 5 minutes, 10 minutes, I can be regulated.
In terms of, regulating, this question speaks to that. Thank you for speaking to the powerless nature of trauma responses. What are some other ways to speak reptilian? And what would be some definite signs that one is finally healing their trauma? And I also miss being able to dance sometimes. So I will admit it.
So, speaking reptilian is to get familiar with the different trauma response that you have individually. And so there's actually 5 different trauma responses, not the 3 ones. The first one, we know fight, flight, and freeze, but there's also fawn and fornicate. So sexual responses can be an activation of a trauma response, and the system is trying to find its intelligence to regulate, but because it's a trauma response rather than a genuine act of intimacy, there's other complexities that need to be navigated with it. So each of these different responses have different ways that we can learn to speak reptilian in terms of how do we navigate when they're there. So aggression can need to be expressed. Flight we can actually need to engage with the big muscles to run. Freeze takes different sensations and textures. Fawn is to check to make sure that we're not using our desire to please somebody to purchase a sense of safety and belonging. And with the fornicate, that's not my specialty. There's somebody else with that one about like how to advise somebody if that is their go-to or that's what happens for them. But what I would imagine is that there needs to be some understanding that the physiological response is part of how one gets back into one's body, and to see if there's other ways of doing that that are supportive, that may be a little bit more congruent with what one's values are.
Thank you, Amma. Coming to another question. This question is, in what ways might one address the puncha of fear stemming from deep-seated and perhaps inherited feeling of shame?
Wow, beautiful question. Beautiful question. So papancha, for anybody who doesn't know that word, is the mind's proliferation. And it's spinning into different stories and different scenarios, and just it's a big movement. So shame is definitely one of the things that can happen for all kinds of reasons. And when there's attachment wounding, then it's also often common that shame is the result. And so when we have more skills or tools about both how those things are formed and then how to correct it, then rather than the papancha or the mind moving into different stories and proliferation around it, we then bring forward the tools and that are reparative.
Amma, we definitely want to get this question because it's it's an interesting one. Dear Amma, thank you so much for your wisdom. I'm curious to know, since you are a Buddhist practitioner, how do you connect trauma with the past life experiences? Thank you.
So there's been a few times when I've had a sense that something that I was living with was connected to a past life trauma. More often, I have been aware that something that I was dealing with was connected to intergenerational trauma and or systemic trauma. And so whether it's from one or the other or the next, what we need is tools to deal with trauma. So on some level, it doesn't matter where it comes from. If it's in our bodies, if it's something that we're navigating, then the opportunity is for us to find the way to meet it and to resolve it.
That's a good answer. And in terms of kind of leaning into the Buddhist angle, I'm curious if you had we are going to wrap things up in a second, but had a Buddhist saint of trauma. And I know you referenced one particular monastic story from the suttas you found to be particularly illustrative, but yeah, are there any kind of figures you can reference from the canon who you feel like sort of illustrate this path through trauma in a particularly meaningful way?
Well, I mean, I think the story of Patachara is good in the sense that you had a person who was um, on her way to give birth. She had a small child. She was with her husband, and a big storm came, and the river started to flood, and um, there was all kinds of multiple scenarios of disaster. And then what ended up happening, and I can't remember the sequence of them all, was that she gave birth to the child. She had to cross the river Her husband got bit by a snake and died. The one child got drowned by the river. The other child was taken away by a predatory bird. And she was absolutely devastated, and on her way home and found out that her parents perished in a fire. So, in a 24-hour period of time, she lost both of her children, her husband, and both of her parents. And so the Buddha found her crazed with grief. She was just out of her mind with grief. And he does not say what he did, but the power of his presence seems to be what was sufficient to move her from being in a situation where what she was dealing with was unmanageable to then being able to do simple things like put on some clothes and being able to listen to what it was that he had to say. But what was interesting to me in that story was that he didn't start teaching her Dhamma until he was ready to hear it. And so, without having language of trauma, without having a way of articulating what his presence did to calm her, we can see, or I can read into the story, that she went from a trauma activation to being into her window of tolerance. Once she was in her window of tolerance, the Buddha was able to instruct her, and from that instruction, she was in a highly potentized state and was able to have very, very deep insight and realization.
Yeah, thank you. That is a very powerful story. And then there's another one where there's a cowherd who's hungry, and the Buddha actually has him get food or get someone to give him food before the Buddha teaches him, and he's actually able to fully dive into the Four Noble Truths. And I'm curious, just one final question before we move over to Zoom. What is the difference or the sameness or the Venn diagram overlap between trauma and dukkha? Is trauma just one, spec slice of the spectrum of all of dukkha, or is it something the same and different? Are there parts of trauma which are not dukkha? How would you relate these two terms?
Um, so dukkha definitely encompasses trauma, but when the Buddha is talking about dukkha, what he's talking about is the suffering of birth, of aging, of sickness, of death, of change, of not getting what you want, of getting what you don't want, and of the kind of impingement that happens because things are constantly, like sankhara dukkha is the way I understand it. I'm not an arahant, so I might not have clear understanding. But it's like, things are constantly disintegrating, and the effort that it takes to process input and to keep things at a basic minimum, that it's not always falling apart. So when the Buddha's talking about dukkha, he's talking about those kinds of dukkha, but that's the kind of dukkha that you practice with. And certainly trauma is dukkha, but the trauma that I'm talking about that's outside of your capacity to manage it's I don't know the right way of, it's a particular category of dukkha. Because, and the reason why I say that is because with all of these other things, the suffering of birth, of aging, of sickness, of death, of change, of not getting what one wants, of having what one doesn't want, and of sankhara dukkha, you can use the Eightfold Noble Path, you can use the factors of awakening, you can use the Four Foundations of Mindfulness, you can use them successfully to deal with it. And with trauma, you need different tools. You need to have bridges before you can use those tools. You need to have preliminary steps before you can make use of the meditation as an effective way of dealing with it. And the reason why is because when we are dealing with an activation, we are not experiencing safety. And the premise of meditation, the way I read it, is that there is safety. If we look at the Satipatthana Sutta, the Four Foundations of Mindfulness, the first instruction is that you go to a root of a tree or to an empty hut or to a wide open space. You sit down, you make yourself present, and you focus inwardly. We've got all of those things are not available to you when you're in a trauma activation. You don't have safety in your body. You don't feel comfortable sitting still. You don't feel you can close your eyes. Those things are not available when we're in a trauma activation. So we need preliminary practices to be able to do the most basic thing.
I've been quite touched by this conversation. Just seeing the chat, I don't know if you've been watching, but the amount of people who are resonating with this is quite unique. I especially appreciate Joseph's love of biking and dog parks. But other ones of, I also feel very seen and understood by your word and insights. And for quite a while, we haven't known how to address this language in people who come to our community. So we are going to list your website, awakeningtruth.org, and relevant links in the chat. But do you have anything else to say about how people can kind of tap into what you're providing if they are working through these elements of trauma?
Well, the integrated meditation program was designed specifically for this. It was specifically for this. And we're accepting applications. If you're interested, you're welcome to find out more. And I have a Wednesday drop in if people want to ask more specific questions about the program and how it works and why it works and the philosophy, the theory, the research behind it. But that's what it was designed for, is to help.
And we'll post a link to that in the chat. And maybe we can get you to visit up here in Seattle and meet people in person as well. And also, what does your mug say? I've been wondering that since you started drinking out of it.
It says spread joy.
That's great. We approve of
Yeah,
that.
good idea.
Good. So for those who are interested, Amma will be joining us on Zoom, and I'm going to paste the link into our Zoom session into the chat. You can click on that. If you don't see it in the chat, just go to clearmountainmonastery.org, scroll down to the Wednesday evening live stream listing, and there will be a link there. And finally, just to say, Amma, we're very grateful, and it's so good to meet you finally.
Likewise.
Right.